Okay, great. So arrays. Um, just, all right. So arrays. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Um, okay. So yeah. So like I said, for today's session, I'll be covering the very basics of arrays, including some common methods, and then we'll be doing part two of this tomorrow. So what is an array? One of the most common ways that people describe an array is to say that it's a list. And so it actually is fairly accurate, and in some other languages like Python, we actually call it a list. As you can imagine, a list is basically a sequential series or a sequential container of data. Um, and so in JavaScript, at least, the array syntax is pretty straightforward, right? It's just an open and closed square bracket with a bunch of data points, and each data point is separated by a comma. So in this case, line 3, we have an array of 3 numbers. On line 5, we have an array of 3 strings. And obviously with an array, we can actually hold really any data type in JavaScript, right? So on line 9, we see us have an array with a number, a boolean, strings, variables, etc. Arrays are very flexible in that way that arrays can hold any data type, including other arrays, which is something we will see quite soon as well. The comma is the way to separate the different data points between an array, and just going forward, each data point is what we call an element in JavaScript, right? So when I say the first element, that just means the first data point in JavaScript. The second element is the second data point inside that JavaScript array, etc. Earlier we talked about what type of was for the primitive data types, and so type of here is actually still it's still somewhat it's still somewhat applicable. But one tricky thing that we're actually going to see is when I do type of and I pass in an array as kind of the thing to check the type of, you'll notice in JavaScript I actually don't get back array, I actually get back object. And the reason why for this is because in JavaScript, if you kind of go deep enough underneath the hood, we'll actually see that arrays are also objects, right? They're just implemented a bit differently. They're almost kind of like custom objects. And so when we do a type of for an array, JavaScript is going to tell us it's an object, which sometimes may be a bit confusing because we actually want to know if something is an array versus a more traditional object, which we'll talk about in early next week. So the best way for us to actually test whether or not something is an array is actually with something called the array.isArray function. Notice how in the array.isArray function, the first A in array is capitalized. And so kind of like how in our lecture on coercion, we may have already mentioned how when you capitalize the first letter in a variable, it usually means you're dealing with a class. And that's exactly what we're doing in this case. The isArray function is a function that exists on the array class. And so that capital A array is actually saying, hey, on the array class, we have this function called isArray. And when we call it and we pass in whatever is variable we're trying to test, it's actually going to give us back basically a Boolean value. It's going to give us back either true or false. If it gives us true, it means the thing that we passed in is an array, and if it's false, it means the thing that we passed in is not an array, right? So if you remember in the coercion segment, if I want to coerce any value to a number and I want to use explicit coercion, I can just call the number class and pass in the value. Here, rather than passing it into the class directly, I'm actually using a method or a function, in this case a .isArray function on the array class, but I'm still passing in something. And once again, this will result in me getting back either a true or a false to determine whether or not something is an array. Okay, and so this is just a bit more of a precise way for us to test whether or not something is an array compared to the type of operator. Accessing objects in an array is something that we do with the bracket syntax. The bracket syntax is something that we've already seen for strings in the sense that if we want to access a first character in a string, we will use bracket access, and so hopefully this is also somewhat familiar. But just as a quick recap, bracket array makes use of, as the name indicates, the square brackets, and inside the square brackets, usually we pass in a number, right? And that number is the index or the position of the element that we're interested in. Just keep in mind that in arrays, at least, the index starts at index 0. So the first element is at position 0, the second element is at position 1, and so on and so forth. And the very last element is at position however long the array is -1, right? So normally when we think of positions, we think of 1, 2, 3. In this case, we start with 0, 1, 2, right? And so everything is almost shifted left to the 1, or shifted left by 1, right? So on line 7, when I do console.logs out name index 0, I'm saying, hey, give me the element at position 0, or the first element of the names array. Similarly, 1, 2, and then also 3. And if I look at the printout, right, for the first 3, it makes sense. I get back George, John, and Thomas as the first, second, and third elements in my array. On line 13 there, when I say, hey, give me the names, give me the element in names index 3, that means give me the fourth element in the array. But the names array only has 3 elements. So what happens then when we ask for the fourth element? Well, in JavaScript, what happens when we do that is we actually don't get back an error, right? What we get back is actually undefined. And so in this case, what JavaScript is telling us is saying, hey, there could be a value here, but you just haven't assigned one yet. And so, this is more of an FYI, just to be careful going forward, is that whenever you use an array, JavaScript for the most part won't tell you if you're using an element that doesn't exist yet, right? Like we are using on line 13. So it's kind of up to you to just kind of be aware in the back of your mind that if you access any position in an array, you are going to get back something, even if that something happens to be undefined. So this is a way that we access, or we kind of fetch the value of an element in an array. And if I ever want to overwrite that value or overwrite or add a value to that array, then all I got to do is go back to our trusty assign operator, which is one equal sign. And so here on line 6 and line 8 and line 10, notice how we're going into the names array and we're saying go to the element of position 0 on line 6, right? So at the first element inside the names array, and set a value equal to Washington, equal to Adams, and equal to Jefferson for the second and third elements respectively. And what that's going to do is that's actually going to replace whatever value we had there before with our new value, right? So we completely overwrite what was there previously with whatever our new values is. And even though we don't show it here, we can overwrite that value with anything, right? So in this case, just because the first element used to be the string George, in this case we overwrite it with the string Washington, but we could also easily overwrite it with a number or another array or a function or a Boolean or anything else, right? There's kind of no limits on that because, as we saw on the first slide, an array can hold almost any data type. Okay, any questions so far?
Yeah, can you go back one slide?
Sure.
All right, so let's say you were to have George, John, comma, and then just do another comma, and then Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
Would I guess nothing between the two commas come up as, would that have an index, and would that be undefined, or would it just like negate that there was even two commas there?
Yeah, no, it would have a value, it would be undefined.
Okay, and that means that console log 3 would be undefined, but console log names 4 would be Thomas?
Yes, yep. So we can just print this out really quickly. So what you're saying,
I guess 2 would be.
Yeah. So let me just. Okay, cool. So we'll just do this in REPL really quick. So your question is, what if I just have an extra comma here? And so now it was 0, 1, 2, and 3, right? When I do this, 0 is still George, second is still John, 3 is now undefined because we acknowledge that the comma says we're making space, if you will, for something in the array. And just because we don't give it a value doesn't mean we didn't make space for it. So this element still exists, and then now 3 becomes Thomas because now we actually have a fourth element in this array.
All right, cool. Thanks.
Yep. Cool. Any other questions? And just so I'm clear, this is hopefully most folks have seen this before in some way, right? Arrays and bracket assignments and bracket access. Yeah, please stop me if this is like completely new and you need me to go slower. But yeah, any other questions before we move on? Cool. All right. I will take your silence to mean that everyone's seen this before, and there are no other questions. Although I see someone did chat me. So me stop share so I can take a look at it. None. Okay, great. Yeah, remember, just yell it out to me if you have anything. By far the easiest way to get my attention without if I'm already in presentation mode. Cool. So yep. So let's keep it moving here. In one of our very first lectures, we talked about how numbers, strings, and booleans are what we call primitive data types because they cannot be changed. Well, an array and a function and objects, which we'll all talk about in subsequent classes, they're the opposite. They're called complex data types or non-primitive, if you want to kind of think of it in a very binary way. And so what that just means is that they are able to be changed, right? So here on line 7, we have an array with the letters B, R, A, C, E, right? And an array with 5 elements. We have the string brace, so a string with 5 characters. A string can never be changed. An array can't. That's the difference between a complex and a primitive data types, right? You can change complex data types. You cannot change primitive data types. And so on lines 10 and 11, in both cases, we are going to quote unquote the first element of the array and the string respectively and saying, hey, change your first element to a G. But when we console log it out, we'll see that in this case, the first letter in the string variable does not change. It is still brace, but the first element in the array does get changed to a G. So now it says GRACE. And so this is just something to be careful about going forward, is just keeping in mind that things in arrays can be changed, things in strings cannot. If you ever want to quote unquote change a value in a string, that basically means you have to make a brand new string. So yeah, so arrays are very much like strings in a lot of ways, but in this case kind of is one really huge glaring way in that, you know, we cannot treat an array the same way as a string because we cannot change them in the same way.
So David, how do you? I think we did it before, but I can't remember. How do you break down the string brace into the individual letters then?
Um, I would say you don't really break it down. You just remake a brand new string.
Oh, okay.
Right. So one of the things that you can do is you can use a for loop to iterate through the string, but that's not necessarily breaking down a string. It's just us reading through the string one letter at a time, taking each letter and then doing something with that letter. And in those cases, we're actually making a copy of the letter and doing something with a copy of that letter, because we are not able to change the original string. Does that make sense? Hello?
Yes. Sorry, I muted myself again.
Yeah, no problem. Cool. Okay, cool. Yeah. So now we're going to talk about a bunch of things that actually are built into JavaScript, what we call properties and methods. They're just fancy ways of saying basically, well, property I think is property, but methods are just a fancy way of saying functions. And we'll talk more about what the distinction between a method and a function is next Wednesday, I believe. But for now, just know that one of the benefits of having this array class being pre-built into JavaScript is that whenever you use it, you actually also have access to a lot of really nice pre-built tools that makes your life a lot easier whenever you do use an array. So for the rest of this class, we're just going to talk about some of these pre-built tools and kind of how to use them. And then for the workshops today, you actually spend a lot of your time rebuilding these tools from the ground up, so you can kind of understand how they work and kind of how they do what they do. Okay, so the first one is .length property, and it's pretty straightforward. Whenever you do any array .length, it just tells you how many elements are in the array. .length, as the name indicates, it's the length of the array, so it starts at 1. So if I have an array of only one thing, the index of the first element and the only element in that array is 0, but the length of it is 1 because there's only one element in there. Oops, sorry. So .length is just a really quick and simple way of getting getting the length of however many elements are in the array. And in the previous example, I think someone asked, what if one of the values was undefined? Well, just because the value is undefined it doesn't mean it's not a value, right? So if I, in this case, if I have an extra comma between John and Thomas, then my length will be 4 because I have 4 things in the array, even if one of those happens to be undefined. Okay, the push method. The push method is basically the easiest way for us to add elements into the end of the array. So whenever we talk about these functions or these methods for arrays, let's distinguish between what the method does, what it returns, and whether or not it modifies the original array. And so those 3 things are actually all very distinct, and it's important for us to be very clear on them, right? So what does a push method do? The push method is a function that takes in values and it adds them to the end of the array. What does it return? It returns back the length of the new array. And lastly is, does the push method change the original array? The answer is yes, right? So here on line 4, I have this names array. On line 6, on the right hand side, I call names.push James, which means I'm adding the string James to the end of my array. But I'm also capturing the return value of the push function in this variable called new length. And push returns back the new length of the array, and so new length is going to be a number. And so when I console log this out, if I console log out names, I see that indeed the original array was changed because I've now added James in as a 4th element, and the new length of the array is 4. Okay, so dot push just adds 1 or more elements. If I want to add in more elements, I just do James, comma, David, comma, something else, right? So I can add a bunch of push is basically a way for me to add things to the end of the array, right? And once again, just to be super clear, it returns the new length of the array, but it also adds in, it also modifies the original array. So I should be careful when I use it, because when I use it, I will be changing names. Dot pop then is the converse of, or the opposite of dot push, in that it removes 1 element from the end of the array. Dot pop, if you see on line 6 there, when we call it, we don't need to pass in any arguments because dot pop by definition only removes 1 element from the end of the array. So what does it do? It removes the last element in the array. What does it return? It actually returns back the element that just got removed. So in this case, when I call names.pop, it actually returns back the value Thomas, because that's the last element in the array. And then lastly, does it change the original array? It absolutely does, right? It takes the original array and rips out the last element. So in this case, after I call .pop, my array now is only of length 2. It only has 2 elements in it, and it returned back the element that just got removed, which was Thomas.
Hey, David.
Yep.
So in the lecture, the pre-lecture,
yep.
Who was it? Nimit was saying that .pop removes the most recently added item.
Yep.
If the most recently added item wasn't to the end of the array but was in the middle of the array, will .pop remove that element that's in the middle of the array or at the end of the array?
It will still remove the thing at the end of the array. Yeah. So I think in the example Nimit gave, I think he was adding things to the end of it, and so that was what got removed. But .pop by definition only removes from the end of the array.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. Cool. So dot push adds to the end of the array. Dot pop removes from the end of the array. And then now we're just going to kind of move to the other side of it, which is how do we add and remove things to the beginning of the array. So dot shift works just like dot pop, except it removes, in this case, the first element of the array. And we call it shift because if you think about it, it's almost the best analogy that I think that makes sense is if I'm in a, if I'm in line at a movie theater, for example, and the first person leaves that line, well, everyone else's position now shifts up 1, right? So here when I call dot shift, when I have an array called names, when I do a names.shift, once again, I don't pass in any arguments because dot shift automatically only removes the first element from the array. It returns that element to me just like dot pop, and it modifies the original array as well, right? So here I have George, John, Thomas. If I call names.shift, George at the very beginning is what gets removed. We return that value from dot shift, and of course the original array now only has length 2. And I know I'm going through this a bit quickly, but just know that you'll have access to these slides, and don't stress out too much about memorizing these functions. Nowadays, anything that you need to do here, everything you need to look up is a quick Google away. Just make sure you understand what these functions does, and if you ever need to kind of Google it, like hopefully it's more to kind of refresh your memory. But yeah, don't stress too much about memorizing these functions directly as much. Yep, so this is dot shift to remove from the first element in the array, and then to complete the quadrology, I guess. How do we add 1 or more elements to the beginning of the array? Well, and quite uncreatively, we created the unshift method, which works just like dot push, except now we're passing in things that gets added to the beginning of the array. It's unshift because now everything gets shifted 1. In a line, if someone cuts the line and stands in the very first, well, now everyone else is kind of 1 position behind where they were before. And just like dot push, dot unshift also returns back the length of the new array after we add in the items. Okay, so push, pop, shift, unshift, push and pop, add and remove from the end of the array, shift and unshift, add or remove from the beginning of the array. Okay, index of is also an array method, and if you're familiar with how it works in the string, in this case index of works very similarly. Index of is pretty much just a search function, right? So if I have an array and I call .index of and I pass in a value, it will look for an exact match to that value. So in this case, on line 6, I'm searching for the string George. On line 7, I'm searching for the string Alexander. What index of does is it will search from left to right, and it will give you back the index or the position of the first match that it finds. And so in this case, if I search index of and I pass in the string George, if I start from left to right, the first George I find happens to be the first element, which is at position 0, and so index of gives me back 0, which says, hey, the match you're looking for, the first match that you're looking for going from left to right is at position 0. If it doesn't find a match, then it gives back -1, which means, hey, it gives back, I guess, what we call an invalid index, which just means, hey, I wasn't able to find this match. The reason why I say an exact match is because it will basically say you have to find the entire match as is. So even though, for example, the string is George, if I search for the string Georg without the e at the end, I would not find a match, right? Because Georg does not exactly match any of the elements in the array, but George, George, does match the first element. And so that's just something to be careful about. Also, what that index of will not do is it will not tell you how many matches are in the array. It will just tell you if there is at least 1 match in the array and give you the position of it. So going back to our kind of 3-point framework, if you will, what does this do? It looks up the position for the first match. What does it return? It returns back the position of the match if it finds one, or it returns back -1 if it doesn't find a match. And then last but not least, does this modify the original array? It does not, because all we're doing is looking through it. We're not changing any of the values in the array. Okay, 2 more here, and then we'll be done. Dot slice is probably the most complicated method we'll talk about today. Just like the method of the same name for the string, dot slice is what we use to basically create a copy of the array, right? So here I have our names array again. On line 6, I do names dot slice and I pass in 2 numbers. What the first argument in the slice function does is it gives you the index of where do I want to start the copy, if you will. In this case, I want to start index 1, which is John. The second number, in this case, the 2, tells you where I want the index of where I want to stop, but it does not include that index, right? So it's a little bit tricky in the sense that I have 2 numbers. The first argument is where I start, and that is inclusive of that number. The second number is the index where I want to stop, but it does not include that number. So if I look at names.slice 1, 2, this means I want to start at index 1, which is the second element, so John, and I want to stop at index 2, so Thomas, but I don't want to include Thomas. So what does that mean? That means all I do is all I do is in my copy, I have an array of only one thing, which is just John, right? So once again, what does this do? It makes a copy of the array depending on the positions that we give it. What does it return? It returns back that copy, right? Or it returns back a new array that has the elements that we want to copy over. And does this modify the original array? It does not, right? If I make a copy of a book or anything, if I think of Xeroxing a piece of paper, I'm not changing the original paper, even though I am quote unquote taking a copy of the values. So this is safe in the sense that we're not modifying the original array, but we just need to be careful that the thing that we get back is what we wanted. Dot slice has a few kind of other quirks too, right? One is, and you'll see this a bit more often as we deal with more and more complex functions, is even though dot slice by default expects two arguments. The first argument is where I stop, and the first argument is where I start. Second argument is where I stop. If I only give it one argument and not a second argument, then what that means is it tells the JavaScript say, hey, start at this index and just copy all the way to the very end, right? So if I started at a slice, if I pass in just one, it means start at position 1 and just copy everything after position 1 all the way to the very end of the array. And last but not least, if I do names.slice and I don't pass in any arguments in, then that's just shorthand for saying, hey, copy the entire thing, right? So start at index 0 and copy the entire array for me. And so here on line 6, that's exactly what we do. We take the names array and we're calling .slice on it, but we're not passing in any arguments, which basically is saying, hey, copy the entire array for me, please. And then once I have that copy, which I store under the variable names copy, I can then edit what I want. In line 8, I go to that copy, I change this third element to Paul, I add in the value Ringo, and all this is to show that once again, whatever we do to the copy, in this case the variable names copy, it does not affect the original. So the original names array is still George, John, Thomas, but in the copied array we've made a bunch of changes, and now it reads George, John, Paul, and Ringo.
Could you explain what happened to Thomas?
Yep, so on line 8 there, right? So Thomas used to be the third element in the copied array. On line 8, all we've done is that we've overwritten Thomas with Paul.
By choosing index 2?
Yeah, so
okay, thanks. Just wanted to be sure.
Yeah, so names copy index 2 before line 8 would have been Thomas, because we're talking about the third element in our copied array. And basically before line 8, our copied array looks identical to our names array. It's also George, John, Thomas. If I go to the copy and say, hey, give me your third element, it's Thomas. And if I override it with Paul, then Paul replaces Thomas. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah, so remember, names.slice returns back the new copy of the array. So if I get a value that I don't store anywhere, then I have no way to access it or use it again later on. So if I just call names.slice without names copy, then when I get to line 8, names copy doesn't exist, right? Because I've never created it. And in fact, the copy that I make from the slice function isn't stored anywhere, so I can never access it ever again. So whenever I call .slice, I almost always should be storing it in a value somewhere. Yep. Any other questions? Cool. All right, then we just have 2 more methods, and we'll be done here. The next one we'll look at is the .includes method. The .includes method is also a search method, except it's kind of it's a little bit even more I guess not less useful, but it's a bit simpler than index of. When we do .includes, once again, all we're doing is passing in a value to search our array for. And once again, just like .index of, it looks for an exact match, so it doesn't look for partial matches. Whatever we're searching for has to match the element exactly. And .includes, all it does is it gives you back a true or a false. If there's any matches at all, it will give you back a true. If there's no matches at all, it will give you back a false. But as a limitation, that includes that includes doesn't tell you where the match is if there is one, and also doesn't tell you how many matches there are. It just tells you, hey, there is a match, or there is not a match. And then last but not least, we have our .reverse methods. And as you can imagine, the .reverse just flips the array. So whatever was the first element is now the last element, and it changes the original array, right? So in this case, we don't need to capture the return value anywhere because we're not creating a new array. What we're doing is we're changing the array that we already have, right? So for George, John, Thomas, if I call that array names.reverse, now my array has been reversed to Thomas, John, and George. Cool. So yeah, as a recap, we talked about an array. We talked about how to use array.isArray to determine whether something is an array. We talked about using the bracket notation to access and also assign values in the array. And we talked about some basic properties and methods that come pre-built into JavaScript for arrays. Like I said, in today's workshop, you'll be recreating a lot of these functionalities or a lot of these methods. Obviously, if we're asking you to recreate, for example, .index of, please don't use .index of in your solution. It kind of defeats the purpose. We want you to be able to kind of build it from the ground up, right? So you really understand kind of what's going on underneath the hood. But yeah, any questions before we get started on the workshop?